The silver earring lay on the floorboard of the empty sedan, a solitary piece of jewelry that had no business being in a place so meticulously cleaned. It was a mismatch, a jagged, ornate thing that seemed to mock the sterile perfection of the cabin. Sydney Shaw had built a life around the idea that some things were simply meant to be perfect. She believed in the quiet comfort of the apartment, the consistent late-night calls, and the way Jake always seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. But as the moonlight spilled through the glass, illuminating the faint, erratic scratches near the glove compartment, that perfection shattered. Looking back, the signs were etched into the very architecture of their shared space. The way the heavy front door lock showed fresh, microscopic damage, and how the floorboards near the closet groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there. I am the narrator of Swasti Diaries, and I am here to peel back the layers of a deception so deep it erased the very identity of those who fell into its orbit. This was not merely a case of a missing person. It was a masterclass in psychological architecture. The investigation started with that single, abandoned earring, but as the files opened, a much darker reality surfaced. Jake was not just a partner. He was a ghost, a man who built his entire existence on the foundations of other people's lives, only to systematically dismantle them. The question remained, how far could a man run before his own shadow finally caught up to him? Sydney Shaw lived a life measured in the soft, rhythmic hum of a veterinary clinic and the quiet, predictable silence of her studio apartment. She was a woman who found solace in the vulnerable, the injured strays she brought home, the fragile routines she built to keep the world at bay. It was this precise solitude that made her so susceptible to the illusion Jake offered. He arrived not with a crash, but with a calculated, gentle persistence. He seemed to understand the exact geometry of her loneliness, filling the empty spaces in her schedule with dinners, soft conversation, and a manufactured sense of security that felt like a sanctuary. Looking back, the trap was laid with surgical precision. Every gesture was a calibrated move, designed to dismantle her natural defenses layer by layer. She believed she had found a partner. In reality, she had invited a phantom into the architecture of her life. The apartment that once felt like a fortress now seemed like a hollow shell, its walls echoing with the weight of a presence that was never truly there. We often wonder how the most intelligent people fall for the oldest deceptions, but the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. The deception was not about what Jake showed her. It was about the parts of himself he successfully erased. As the investigation deepened, the question shifted from who Sydney Shaw was to what she had unknowingly been protecting. The mismatch of that silver earring remained the focal point, a jagged metallic anomaly in a life that had been meticulously curated to appear seamless. If he was the perfect partner, then why did his presence leave behind such jagged, broken edges? The parking lot of the Oakwood Plaza was a desolate expanse of cracked asphalt, slick with a fine layer of midnight drizzle. It was here, beneath the flickering hum of a dying sodium lamp, that the pattern first emerged. Detective Miller surveyed the scene, his boots clicking against the wet ground. The victim's car sat perfectly parked, its driver's side door locked and the engine cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass, and no frantic scramble for safety. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the humid air. However, the ground told a different story. Near the rear tire, a single silver earring lay embedded in a shallow puddle, its ornate filigree catching the dull orange light. It was a delicate, expensive piece, far too intricate for the modest jewelry the victim had worn. Miller crouched low, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a second anomaly. A set of faint, uneven drag marks leading toward the perimeter fence where the security cameras had been expertly blinded with industrial tape. The contradiction was immediate and chilling. The car remained secure, yet the perimeter had been breached with surgical, almost clinical efficiency. If the goal was a simple abduction, why leave behind a signature as distinct as that earring? It suggested a predator who did not just erase his victims, but toyed with the evidence of his own presence. Miller stared at the earring, realizing the silence of the parking lot was not empty. It was a deliberate, constructed void. The investigation had moved beyond a missing person case. It was now a hunt for a ghost who left physical breadcrumbs. The silver earring was not merely a decorative loss. It was a calibrated signifier. Back in the sterile quiet of the precinct, the forensic analysis confirmed the metal was high-grade platinum, far exceeding the budget of the victim's typical wardrobe. This discrepancy pointed toward a deliberate plant, a signature left by someone who understood the value of a trail. When Detective Miller accessed the victim's encrypted laptop, the digital ghost of her last interaction materialized. A profile under the name Julian had engaged her for weeks. The linguistic patterns, the cadence of the messages, and the precise timing of the invites mirrored the exact psychological tactics Jake had utilized during his initial meetings with Sydney. It was a terrifying realization. The perpetrator was not just erasing women. He was replicating his own predatory methodology across multiple identities. Miller traced the server logs to a private storage facility on the outskirts of the city. The digital footprint led to a unit registered under a shell company, a location that had never surfaced in the victim's personal records. As Miller arrived at the facility, the cold air bit into the metal of the lock. He forced the hinge, the heavy door groaning as it swung inward to reveal a space that felt like a museum of stolen lives. Row upon row of personal mementos, watches, scarves, journals, sat untouched in the dark. Among these artifacts lay a single rusted brass key, resting on a stack of journals. The key did not match any of the lockers. It was a physical contradiction that suggested a deeper layer to the network, implying that Jake was not just a lone predator, but a component of a much larger, darker machinery. The key was not a solution. It was a map to a labyrinth. As the heavy door of the storage unit groaned open, the air inside tasted of stale static and long-abandoned secrets. I expected a hidden room, perhaps a sanctum of personal items, but the reality was far more clinical. The unit contained nothing but a series of industrial shelves, each meticulously labeled with dates that spanned over a decade. These were not the mementos of a singular obsession, but the discarded remnants of lives systematically erased. My investigation had operated on the assumption that Jake was a predator of opportunity, selecting targets based on vulnerability and proximity. The shelf labels shattered that logic. The dates overlapped, the locations spanned across continents, and the objects themselves were categorized by the victim's specific habits. It became clear that Jake did not choose these women. He processed them. The presence of the brass key now felt like a taunt, a deliberate breadcrumb left by someone who wanted his methodology observed. As I sifted through the collection, the forensic reality settled in. The items were not trophies, but evidence of an administrative process. This was a ledger of human disposal. The most chilling discovery was a folder buried beneath a stack of scarves, containing digital drives and encrypted journals. These documents detailed not just the how, but the why. A psychological blueprint for neutralizing individuals without leaving a ripple in their social fabric. If Jake was merely a component in this design, then the predator I hunted was not a man, but a system that had finally left a physical trace behind. The discovery of the encrypted journals forced a radical recalibration of the entire investigation. I turned my attention to the peripheral figures in Jake's life, the former colleagues and professional acquaintances who had occupied his orbit before he vanished into his next fabrication. Their accounts were not merely inconsistent, they were mathematically impossible. One coworker from a firm in Chicago recalled a man named Marcus, a shy accountant who preferred the dim glow of his corner desk to the sunlight of the office floor. Another individual, a former associate from a logistics company in Seattle, described a boisterous project manager named David who thrived in high-stakes, late-night meetings. Neither description matched the physical profile I had established, yet the behavioral patterns were identical. Each version of Jake utilized the same specific cadence of speech, the same preference for dark, quiet corners, and the same uncanny ability to anticipate questions before they were asked. He was a chameleon, but he did not change his colors to hide. He changed his identity to survive. The evidence suggested that his persona shifting was not a predatory tactic, but a desperate, rhythmic defensive mechanism. He lived in constant, calculated motion, fearing the very system he appeared to serve. If Jake was indeed a loose end in a larger, more structured organization, then his unpredictability was not a weakness, it was a warning. The deeper I delved into these conflicting testimonies, the more it appeared that the predator was being hunted by his own masters. The question remained: what did he know that was so vital, and why were his former lives being methodically scrubbed from existence just as I began to piece them together? The storage unit was supposed to be the final nail, the physical anchor that tied Jake to his sprawling web of fabrications. When I finally confronted him, standing in the dim, flickering light of the parking garage, I expected a tremor, a shift in his carefully constructed mask. Instead, he simply reached into his coat and produced a folder. His movements were fluid, devoid of any genuine anxiety. He presented documents, official-looking, stamped and verified, that claimed he had been in a completely different city during the dates I had pinned to his movements. The contradiction was absolute. My evidence, the storage key and the maps I had painstakingly cataloged, suddenly felt like the delusions of an overworked mind. He spoke with a quiet, devastating calm, dismantling my timeline with a precision that bordered on the clinical. He did not deny the existence of the unit. He merely recontextualized it as a shared space for an associate whose identity he refused to reveal to protect them from the very network I was beginning to suspect. Every time I reached for a concrete fact, he offered a plausible, yet unverifiable, alternative. He stood there, perfectly still, as the weight of his reality began to crush my own. My notes, which once seemed like a roadmap to the truth, now appeared as nothing more than a series of disconnected, coincidental events. I looked at the key in my hand, its jagged teeth catching the moonlight, and for the first time, I wondered if I was the one being misled, or if the truth was simply too complex to be held in the light of day. The trap had closed, but it was not clear who was on the inside. The keychain I retrieved from the storage unit felt heavier than its size suggested, a cold, jagged piece of metal that seemed to anchor a decade of lies. Back in the sterile quiet of the lab, I ignored the ticking clock and focused on the microscopic wear patterns on the brass. A forensic technician had already flagged the item, but the result was a jolt that shifted the entire foundation of the investigation. The microscopic debris embedded in the teeth of the key, a specific mixture of industrial-grade lubricant and oxidized copper, matched a series of unsolved break-ins from 10 years ago. These events occurred in a city 3 states away, long before the man I knew as Jake ever crossed paths with Sydney Shaw. This wasn't just a simple case of a man with a hidden past. It was a ghost story written in physical evidence. The timeline was impossible. If he was the owner of that key, he was not the man who had been building a life with Sydney over the last 3 years. He was a chameleon, shedding his history like a snake, and I had been chasing a mask that didn't even exist when the initial crimes were committed. My breath caught as I realized the implications. The storage unit wasn't a collection of personal mementos. It was a repository of identities. I stared at the evidence, the cold reality settling in. The man I was hunting had been dead, or at least someone else, long before he ever met his current victim. The trap I thought I had set for him had failed because I was trying to cage a shadow, unaware that the shadow had a long, violent history that predated his current persona by an entire decade. The motive emerged not from a chaotic impulse, but from a calculated, predatory need for total erasure. As I cataloged the contents of the storage unit, the pattern became undeniable. Jake did not simply kill. He cannibalized identities. Every item, a mismatched earring, a discarded driver's license from a different decade, a worn theater ticket, represented a life he had systematically dismantled and absorbed. He was a parasite, surviving by shedding his own skin and wearing the remnants of his victims to build a fragile, temporary facade. My analysis of the encrypted journals revealed the chilling logic behind his choices. He targeted women who were already isolated, Women who possessed the kind of vulnerability that allowed him to step in as a savior, only to begin the slow, methodical process of rewriting their personal histories. He needed to be the architect of their reality, ensuring that when he eventually moved on, there was nothing left for anyone else to find. The storage unit was not merely a collection of trophies. It was a graveyard of abandoned personas, a physical testament to his fear of being known. He was terrified of his own lack of substance, a hollow man who only existed in the reflection of those he destroyed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was not just a killer. He was a ghost desperately trying to anchor himself to the world by stealing the lives of others. The final entry in his journal, written in a cramped, frantic script, detailed his next target. The name on the page was not Sydney Shaw, but a name he had used years before he ever arrived in this city. The cycle was not ending. It was accelerating. For 72 hours, the investigation centered on a local transient, a man whose history of petty theft and erratic behavior made him the perfect scapegoat. The evidence seemed to align with a sickening clinical precision. A witness claimed to have seen him lurking near the apartment complex on the night of the disappearance, his presence documented in a series of grainy, low-light security stills. We built a wall of circumstantial facts around him, convinced that the predator had finally left a trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow. The case against him felt airtight. It was a narrative of opportunity and desperation that satisfied every procedural requirement. I stood in the archives reviewing the final timeline, ready to close the file on a solved mystery. But then I noticed a discrepancy that turned the entire theory into ash. A time-stamped photograph, recovered from a secondary, private dashcam located 3 blocks away, captured the transient at a gas station at the exact moment he was supposedly stalking the apartment. The man was not our predator. He was merely a ghost in the machine of someone else's design. This was not a random act of a desperate drifter, but a deliberate misdirection. The realization that the transient had been framed served as a chilling reminder. The true predator was not just watching the victims, he was watching us. He was orchestrating our investigation, feeding us false leads to ensure we chased shadows while he remained, as always, beyond our reach. If he had planted the drifter, what else had he fabricated to keep his own identity buried? The realization that the transient was a decoy shifted the entire investigation into a different gear. I returned to the apartment, not as a searcher of physical debris, but as an analyst of a predator's design. The laptop sat on the desk, its screen dark, a silent monolith hiding the architecture of a dozen ruined lives. When the decryption finally bypassed the security protocol, the screen flickered to life, revealing a file structure organized with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. These were not just notes, they were encrypted journals, a comprehensive ledger of psychological predation. Each entry detailed the systematic isolation of his targets, documenting how he identified women with fractured support systems, then meticulously eroded their autonomy until they were entirely dependent on his fabricated persona. He had not just killed them, he had curated their destruction. The journals mapped a pattern of movement that spanned 3 states, confirming that the mismatched earring found months ago was not an anomaly, but a trophy kept from a previous life. As I read the time-stamped entries, the logic of his movements became clear. He was never acting alone in the way I first assumed. The journals contained references to a larger network, a shadow organization that viewed his murders as a necessary cleaning service. He was a specialist in erasure, a tool that had eventually become too visible to the very people who had once commissioned his work. The final entry, written only hours before I arrived, contained a single chilling instruction for the destruction of the hard drive. He had underestimated the speed of our recovery, and in his haste, he left the blueprint of his entire existence behind. Now the hunter was the one being hunted, and the network he served was surely watching his next move. The timeline of the past 5 years unfolded like a series of surgical strikes. I cross-referenced the encrypted journal entries against property records and utility logs from 3 different states. The pattern was unmistakable. Jake did not simply move, he executed a calculated migration. He remained in a city for exactly 14 months, the precise duration required to establish a local credit history and a superficial social veneer before the inevitable scrutiny of his neighbors began. Each relocation coincided with a police investigation in his previous territory, a silent, ghost-like retreat triggered by the first hint of an inquiry. He operated under the assumption that the authorities were static, while he remained fluid. However, the journals revealed a critical oversight. He kept a physical ledger of his targets, a habit he clearly viewed as a necessity for his own psychological stability. This led me to a series of discarded transit receipts found within the storage unit. They mapped a path that bypassed major highways, favoring backroads that kept him off the radar of automated license plate readers. As I reconstructed his movements, it became evident that he was not only hiding from the law but from a larger, more predatory entity. The entries spoke of a cleansing that he was tasked to perform, a euphemism for the systematic erasure of women who had become liabilities to his shadowy employers. He was a disposable asset, a man who built his entire life on the fragile foundation of someone else's secrets. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the discrepancy between his digital persona and the physical evidence of his travel. He was running out of places to disappear, and the network was closing the distance faster than he anticipated. The floorboards in the hallway did not creak, but the silence of the apartment felt heavy with the weight of a trap. I stared at the screen of my own phone, the device I trusted as a lifeline, and saw the active GPS ping reporting my exact location to a remote server. It was not a glitch. Jake had installed a kernel-level tracking script during the week he offered to fix my hardware. Every move I made, every route I mapped for my escape, and every transit point I scouted was being fed directly back to him. The realization shattered the illusion of my autonomy. I had been planning a departure through the service stairwell, believing the security camera there was disabled by a power surge I triggered 3 days prior. But the logs on the local network showed the camera was never offline. It was merely redirected to a private stream. He knew I was leaving. He was not just waiting for me to run. He was waiting for me to reach the precise location where he could ensure my disappearance would be labeled as a voluntary flight. I looked down at the spare key I held, the one to the storage unit, and realized it was the only piece of the puzzle he had not yet recovered. If he was monitoring my phone, he knew I possessed the ledger. The escape route was compromised, the exit was a bottleneck, and the predator had already adjusted his position to meet me at the threshold of my own undoing. I was not chasing a ghost anymore. I was walking directly into his grasp. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, the air shifted from tense to suffocating. Jake sat at the table, his posture unnaturally relaxed, a laptop glowing with lines of code that mirrored the very script I had discovered on my phone. He did not look up. He did not need to. The truth hung in the space between us like a physical weight. He was never just a predator. He was a ghost in the machine, a discarded operative for a network that viewed him as a liability. I tossed the storage key onto the table, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. It landed beside his own burner phone, the one he thought he had wiped clean. As the light from the street lamp spilled across the table, it illuminated the mismatched earring I had recovered weeks ago, now sitting next to his tactical watch. The logic was inescapable. He had been performing a high-stakes shell game, using us to hide his own trail from those who hunted him. He looked at the key, then at me, and for the first time the mask of the perfect partner crumbled into raw, desperate panic. He was not protecting me. He was using my life as a firewall. I saw the realization hit him. The encrypted journals in that storage unit were not just trophies, they were his insurance policy, and I had just bypassed his primary security layer. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a home, but the stillness of a trap that had finally snapped shut on the wrong person. He stood up slowly, but the game was already over. The evidence chain was complete. I had the ledger, the key, and the digital ghost of his past, and he had nowhere left to run. The sirens that finally tore through the pre-dawn stillness were not a rescue, but a final mechanical punctuation to a story that had been written in shadows. The apartment stood empty, the air still thick with the residue of a life carefully curated to deceive. When the authorities breached the perimeter, they found only the cold, hard geometry of his failure, the journals, the keys, and the digital ghost he could no longer anchor to reality. Jake was gone, processed into the system he had spent years trying to subvert. Yet the damage to my own sense of reality remained a jagged, unhealed edge. Looking back, the terror was not in the violence he threatened, but in the effortless way he had occupied the space of my life, turning my trust into a weapon against me. The storage unit revealed a graveyard of identities, a chilling inventory of women who had been erased just as methodically as I had nearly been. This was not a random encounter. It was a calibrated extraction, a shell game played by a man who had long ago forgotten his own name. I walked away from the wreckage of that life, knowing that some truths are not found in the answers, but in the realization of how close we come to vanishing entirely. The files are closed, the evidence is logged, and the ghost has finally been exorcised from the machine. For more deep dive investigations into the shadows of human nature, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.